Hi everyone, we're excited to welcome you to this evening's keynote lectures and reception, and to open the first of the 3 workshops over 3 years under the umbrella title, as we have just heard, People of the Sand, People of the Tent, Archaeological Perspectives on Mobility and Fluidity in Ancient Regions of Western and Central Asia. We are, of course, especially grateful to various funding bodies whose generosity has allowed us to meet here in New York City, to have a place to gather in safety and in community, unlike so many scholars and teachers around the world today. We acknowledge the Rosa Marie Lewent Conference on Ancient Studies and, of course, NYU's Centre for Ancient Studies, directed by Matthew Santarocco. Matthew's intrinsic support for our project, his encouragement and his advice have been instrumental in getting us here today. We'd also like to acknowledge Anna Donch, sitting over here, the program administrator at the centre, whose behind the scenes work has ensured that everything runs smoothly. Thank you both for all that you have done for us. The GNU, we'd also like to acknowledge NYU's Global Network University, the fund that facilitates such meetings designed to bring together scholars from across NYU's global network and beyond. I'd also like to acknowledge Awam Amkar, the NYU Dean of Arts and Humanities, whose early support for our workshop idea allowed us to start planning this first meeting. And finally, the NYU Abu Dhabi Research Institute, whose support will allow us to continue our conversation about mobility this time next year in Abu Dhabi. So, mobility matters. It's demonstrably current. It forms a subtext to many of the headlines we wake up to each morning, if we're looking at the news. But people's movements, voluntary, forced, and how and why they move, have shaped society and affected human culture for millennia. Today, mobility remains both a foundational concern and a rich opportunity for governments and institutions around the world as they grapple with increasing numbers of people on the move due to war, religion, climate crises, politics, and economics. This workshop has been about 5 years in the making. Yifat and I first started to talk about a collaborative endeavour in 2019 when we first met. Mobility, and here we're thinking more specifically about nomads, was an obvious starting point to allow us to consider Western and Central Asia under one intellectual umbrella, incorporating a theme that resonated across deep time up to today. After all, long-distance land and sea routes have linked Afro-Eurasia, the Afro-Eurasian landmass, for millennia. The term people of the sand, people of the tent came up during one of our conversations, and given its familiarity across our regions of study, the direct link to mobility and an oblique reference to ecology, it seemed especially apt. Yet few studies have done what we are attempting to do, to have a longue durée perspective on arid regions to frame questions of mobility and fluidity. After all, there seems to be a general consensus that one of the main characteristics of mobile populations is their diverse practices, often contingent on the ecotones they inhabit. Yet a major stumbling block to broader discussions about nomads and mobility rests on terminology. Even within just Central Asian archaeology, discussions in the recent literature about the terminology that we use to refer to nomads is laden. A quick perusal of this literature underlines the many words we use: pastoralists, mobile pastoralists, agro-pastoralists, mobile populations, to name a few. By inviting a small but dynamic group of scholars with diverse training across key regions of the Old World, Israel, the Levant, the Gulf and Central Asia, we envisage that such diversity will serve to facilitate robust opportunities to achieve the ultimate goal of this first workshop, a working definition of mobility. I will pass now over to Yifat, who will give you some more details about our workshop.
Okay, thank you, Fiona. So, shalom. As you heard, I'm Yifat Thareani, the director of the program in archaeology at NYU Tel Aviv. and proudly associated with the Skirball Department of Hebrew and Judaic Studies here in New York, and a research archaeologist at the Hebrew Union College, which is 1 block away. Not for long. We at NYU Tel Aviv are so thrilled to be part of this desert adventure, as we are so pleased to have you attend this event today. We want to thank all our friends and colleagues who came from the near and from afar. Special thanks are due to Professor Matthew Santirocco, the one and the only one, and Ms. Anna Donch, unforgettable Anna, from the Center for the Ancient Studies, for this wonderful organization, their dedicated care, and their everlasting support. Thank you. I want to especially thank Dr. Fiona Kidd, Professor Fiona Kidd, I'm sorry, Professor Kidd, for my partner, first of all, in this journey, and NYU Abu Dhabi for their full cooperation with us at NYU Tel Aviv on this groundbreaking project. We have spent many hours working together to conceive of this project and develop it together. In his Twilight of the Idols, Friedrich Nietzsche exclaimed that only ideas won by walking have any value. It took some time, but archaeologists finally realized that bringing life to the past requires identifying movements. Now, when movement is discussed, it is often the place, the destination, the place they come from or ended up, the destination that is emphasized. Rarely discussed are the movements in between. For there is a preference for fixity rather than flow. In this way, a stillness and backwardness are imposed on the past. In the absence of alive communities and agents, how can we revive and make the voice of ancient societies, especially of the silent majorities, right? In our continuous dialogue, Fiona and I have seen mobility as a key factor in shaping the history of the ancient world. Studying mobility is about being fluid, but at the same time related to a structure. This conference celebrates people living in the margins, in the arid zones, while past research tended to see these people as isolated, passive, and static, who waived their own identity and assimilated the ruling power of their time. Anthropological and archaeological studies show that, as a matter of fact, desert societies were active agents in writing their memories and histories. The idea to examine the movement of desert communities derived from our desire to bring life, and it seems that more than anyone else, desert communities own the inherited potential to change their lives by way of virtue and to adjust themselves to changing political and social circumstances. Our goal is, along the way perspective on arid regions, to reframe questions of mobility and fluidity. We envisage 3 workshops held annually in a series of evolving discussions. Key issues relating to mobility will be studied at critical locations across NYU's global network to ensure multivocality in diverse geographies. We aim to bring together a dynamic group of scholars from the Levant, Arabia, the Gulf, Central Asia, to put forward new ideas about mobile community in local and global contexts. Outcomes of our discussion will be published in a peer-reviewed, edited volume at the conclusion of our meetings. The various case studies that will be presented here today and tomorrow shed light on the conscious and unconscious behavioral patterns that appear among semi-nomads or desert communities across the ancient world, with scholars who explore the archaeology and history of these 3 arid regions from Bronze Age to modern day. In a way, this cross-regional interaction illustrates well the global university that NYU is. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me here. It's a great pleasure to sit on the edge of such an exciting conference. Thank you, Fiona. Thank you, Yifat. My brief is to talk about mobility generally. And as the title Ancient Mediterranean Studies shows, I'm more sea than desert as a person. So you're going to get bits of sea in this. But I hope some of the points I make will have a slightly broader impact. And the talk has 4 parts, so you can count them off as you think about the reception afterwards, or more sensibly about Lakshmi's brilliant presentation that will follow. Somewhere in the summer of 2017, we had a silly season burst of activity in the British media when it was noticed that a BBC cartoon strip showed black people in Roman Britain. People of colour, as we'd say over here. This aroused all sorts of frantic tweeting and discussion. I wanted to start by asking what's at stake there. Now, of course, this is not unrealistic, as the researchers showed. There's the famous find of the ivory bangle lady from 4th century Roman York near the northern bit of the Roman Empire. And you'll see what was found on the left and what was reconstructed on the right. And a multi-pronged approach to the artifacts and to the person brought out a sense that we have here somebody who has a mix, probably of black and white facial traits, maybe somebody brought up in North Africa, maybe somebody whose parents were brought up in different places. She's certainly not a slave. There's no signs of hard work during her lifetime. Stable isotope analysis makes it pretty unclear that she spent her childhood in New York, although where it could be is much less clear. And rich ornaments, ivory and jet bracelets, and maybe a Christian message on the box add more and more dimensions to this person. Now, there's nothing strange about people of colour in the Roman Empire. We have, or indeed in the Mediterranean long before that, there are images of people with African features from the Greek world and from the Roman world as well. Longer periods of research have been carried out, particularly using stable isotope analysis, looking at the movement of people within the broad area of the Roman Empire, so-called Roman diasporas. And you'll see these points have appeared both in broadsheets like the TLS and in blogs as well. 2 of the people speaking most strongly about this issue were Mary Beard and Sarah Bond, both of them trying to make clear that this should not be the big scandal people thought it was. Now, why should it be a scandal to find traces of people from North Africa or descended from people from North Africa in bits of the northern bits of the Roman Empire? And I put at the top some of the questions that arise. So when we think, why should we think that it's strange that people in the past moved about? Why should we think it's odd that they moved about as much, or at least to a certain extent, as much as people do today? And when we think about people moving about, what were the patterns they moved in? Not great waves, not people moving out in single patterns, but complicated return flows of migration going backwards and forwards, circular journeys among communities closely related by kin. And we should also wonder whether things like that the black British centurion on the BBC strip represent a disruption of Roman society as much as a disruption of our imagining of Roman society. And the reasons I suggest that this aroused such a lot of panic in Britain in the summer were to do with questions about nationality and identity, property and propriety, ancestry. And hidden beneath this, a kind of sense that the Romans are really us, and there shouldn't be people who we don't think of as us among them. Bruce Hitchner has a lovely story about being taken out into North Africa to visit some Roman remains. I think it was in Tunisia rather than Algeria. And he's taken there by the local guide who says, these buildings were built by the Romans and they were the ancestors of the French. And so this sense that we have a simple story of genealogy and a story which has an undisclosed core of whiteness is at the heart, perhaps, of some of the anxieties that we find in relation to modern migrations as well. It's very striking that of the many refugees who've come into the United Kingdom in recent years, the Ukrainians have been accepted with open arms and embraced and settled easily. Refugees from Syria, not so much. Now, what I want to do in what follows is unpack a little bit about mobility as a constant in human behaviour. And so my big proposition is that we've always been mobile. I know we've always been mobile because I was hired at a very late moment to help out with a global history of migration that had grown way, way, way beyond what the commissioning editors thought was going to happen. They thought one volume would sort of sort it, but the very dynamic editor, Manny Ness, kept finding more and more migrations and mobilities to do. The first volume covers essentially early human expansion, but then it goes on to more and more Lamata. And it was quite fun working with all of this. Migration studies is a huge, booming area in the academy. And it's a booming area of the kind that spills across traditional boundaries. So anthropologies and sociologies of migration, archaeologies and histories, literatures, migration literatures, diasporic studies, all of this. And of course, also sometimes good, sometimes not so great, the genetics of migration below it all. And, you know, at least one person in the room suddenly thinks, oh God, he's going to mention Etruscans. I'm not going to mention Etruscans. So all of this happening, buzzing around. In terms of the big picture, and this is just one of many illustrations, this is roughly what we think happened in the last 80 to 100,000 years. And the numbers are thousands of years before present. And so Homo sapiens developing, maybe 300,000, maybe 200,000, moving out by stages, saltation out towards, this always surprises my students, Australia before they get to Britain. What on earth were they thinking? And then eventually finding their way up, further up through Eurasia and then across down into the Americas. And those dates are conservative dates. I mean, I think almost everybody I know thinks that we should be really putting numbers in the low 20s down there. And so we have this global story of how we start from one place, and it takes us about 100,000 years to move beyond. So mobility, we're hardwired, and there are many versions of this that you can look at. And I removed the pictures that also show bananas and other things going in the opposite direction. These are some of the genetic approaches to it. I put the dates on because almost every map you do has changed from one year to another. This is very much cutting edge of where we're looking at human migration. But the broad picture, out of Africa and then spreading southeast, northwest, and then northeast and on into the Americas. In terms of narratives, I particularly like this wonderful book by Clive Gamble, who was a colleague of mine when we both sat on an advisory panel at the British Museum. And he tells a story in which the human race begins together and ends together. That we start in very small areas, up the rift, out through, across the Arabian Peninsula, maybe up the Rift Valley towards Georgia, and then spread in all sorts of different directions. And then the last few hundred years only are the story of the Great Reconnect, the story of mobile populations who, traveling around the world, bump into others of their relatives. Now, of course, the first ones are more distant relatives, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and so on. But the end of this story, the point where the last oceanic islands are reached, is only 1,000 years ago, the point at which New Zealand, Hawaii, Iceland, and a few other remote oceanic islands are reached. This story is only just finished. So Gamble's view is a 100,000-year arc of separation and reconnection, which is a beautiful way to put it, I think. But there's a problem. Why do we do it? Not what are the conscious motives, but why could we do it? What makes humans mobile? What makes us able to move? And there have been some extraordinary discussions of this by biological anthropologists. One thing we've noticed is that humans are able to move into new ecological niches in a way that very few other species do. Clive has this idea that we move up to the ice comes down and we shrink, the ice goes up when we go on, when the sea levels drop during the ice ages, we cross borders, we get isolated. So there's definitely a climatic pump, if you like, running it all. But there's other things too. We are not fussy eaters. The idea of a population of ancestral pandas conquering the world is very, very unlikely because they are so picky. But we eat anything, and you don't need to wander around Greenwich Village to prove this. Yeah, there are human populations that have adapted to almost entirely vegetarian diets and diets almost entirely of fish. The amount of meat protein in the diet has varied again and again. We've been able to sustain broad social networks as we move. There's people who eat nothing but carbs, and of course nowadays there's people who never eat carbs, that eat anything but carbs. And so we have a versatility which allows us to move, and we have a phenotypical versatility too. It's not a surprise that people who live closer to the equator tend to have darker skin. But when you think about those pictures of mobility I showed you, you realise that their ancestors had lighter skin and their ancestors darker skin. So there's a sort of movement up and down. And just to remind you what we're not, these are our near cousins. These people, they just don't get out much. They live in very, very narrow ecological niches. They have particular life ways that are different from each other. But again, they're not expansionist. So there's something about humans that means we should begin the history of mobility by thinking we are, not only is mobility the norm, it is an unusually human trait to be quite this mobile. Part 3, we'll return to what I really know about, to the ancient Mediterranean. There's been a mass of recent studies in the last 20 years, and particularly the last 10 years, on mobility in the ancient Mediterranean, the Roman world. And by and large, these two statements here sum up an emerging consensus that mobility isn't just an interruption to the normal state of affairs, but it structures the normal state of affairs. That ancient societies depend on patterns of human mobility. And Elena Isaiah, writing about Roman Italy, talks about this beautifully. It is not exceptional. It's built into the way society functioned. And then writing of the late Republic, business depends on it, military depends on it, a workforce, and my own work I've looked at seasonal mobility in cities as well as in the countryside. At Brent Shaw on the populations of harvesters who move around through the ancient world. And Claudia Moatti also writing in the same direction. And here are just a few of the recent publications being done on some of these themes, beginning from simply demonstrating mobility, but now what we're doing is we're trying to map it and see how does it work? What are the variations? What are the things that are specific to mobility in this period? A few conclusions from the Roman case. There are very high levels of local mobility, people who move within a particular region from city to city, but almost no long-distance mobility. Perhaps 0.1% of the Roman Empire's populations take a long-distance journey every year. Who moves? Men move. Almost no women move in the ancient world, unless they're in chains. So we have societies of people who mostly stay still, connected up by a tiny group who are nevertheless fantastically influential, soldiers, merchants, and then the even smaller group were the ones who pop up in literary records, princes, governors, missionaries, and so on. Why did this happen? At least one reason is that the transport capacity is incredibly low. There are no great ancient passenger vessels. Obviously, there's no railroads. All the conditions that move people about so much from in the last few hundred years are not there in the ancient world. And the movement is not random, it's not bound in motion. Two-way migrant flows, connections established. And as these build up, we see an empire that is constructed of many overlapping and intersecting diasporas. And this is just in the area around the Mediterranean. Beyond, nomadic alternatives. And you'd have been talking about this already, and we'll talk more tomorrow. But populations who live in completely different ways. Some of them pastoralists, some of them part pastoralist and part farmers, and some who live on the edge, moving between the ecotones. We see them very early on. The Scythians, perhaps the best attested early historic group, right there between the Tiger and the Mediterranean and Iranian areas, and going on right into late antiquity. Complementary economies. Brent Shaw wrote an amazing article called "Eaters of Flesh, Drinkers of Milk," the way describing not the reality of ancient nomads, but the way they seem from the perspective of people writing in the Mediterranean heartlands. Nomads whose ways are described mostly by the ways in which they differ. People don't say of nomads, oh, they have marriages, and they use iron, and They use leather because everyone does those things. What they pick out in the ancient ethnographies are the strange things, real or imagined. And so nomads who are both alien or alienated, construct as alien by people in the middle, but also locked into all sorts of cycles of trade and interdependence, and we now think about other kind of cultural connections. There's also forced mobility in the ancient world, and this appears all over. You have many illustrations of Assyrians deporting captives on their art. This one is, again, from the British Museum, but this is a family, maybe a Judean family from Nineveh, being kidnapped away. And then also the diasporic communities. Here you have for the illustration of the Book of Tobit in the Apocrypha, of Tobias and the angel traveling on long diasporic trays from Ecbatana and around Babylonia and so on. Ancient people would have found it very strange that we find mobility weird. Constant myths of origin and constant explanations and narratives have people moving from the Homeric poems on to late antiquity. I'm coming near the end. What about controlling mobility? This book, Gens de Passage, is one of the earliest attempts by Claudia Moiti and his collaborators to look not just at people moving in the ancient and medieval and early modern worlds, but also attempts to limit their movement. And it's really only when you do begin to dig into the history of border guards or of passports or controls that you realize how completely alien that is to most human societies. You could travel easily around the Roman Empire, between Rome and Persian Empire, without any documentation at all. We're seeing, in other words, the intersection of stories of mobility and stories of the nation state. Travel documents occasionally appear earlier, but it really is only in the late 19th and early 20th century, so with modernity, that attempts appear to limit migration or to direct it. And here we have grim records of other kinds of forced migration. 20th century states have tended to be very hard on migrants. Maybe you're going to discuss this tomorrow, I don't know. There is, of course, the Roma and Sinti genocide in Nazi Germany. There's what collectivization in Soviet Russia did to nomadic populations in Eurasia. There are many, many stories of this, of attempts to go beyond prejudice against nomads and mobile people into actually trying to make them sit still and live the lives that others think they should live. And this, of course, still continues. The attempts to control the Western Sahara, to divide it up first among colonial powers and then among modern African powers as well, and the attempts of inhabitants of the Sahara to assert alternative ways of life that don't fit neatly into those boxes. Fiona mentioned the causes of mobility today, and they are mostly grim stories, I suppose, except, of course, the mobility we all use to come to conference like this. But the causes of mass mobility we normally think of as among the four horsemen of the apocalypse, don't we? Willy Brandt, in 1980, published this fundamental book, North-South, that attempted to persuade the West that the key border was not between the East and the West, between capitalist and communist, but between the rich and the poor. And the Brandt line between richer and poorer economies, which is now, of course, nearly 50 years old, is still, in many respects, more or less where he had it then. Drivers for modern mobility. War. Refugees, destabilized states, states of people who do not want to be migrants who are now being drawn into mobility. Climate change increasingly, and bound to be more of this in the future. And what this shows us with big units, of course, it'll be interesting to see what happens in Polynesia with climate change, and whether we'll see this very relatively recent settlement of the Pacific turn back on itself. And so I want to conclude with a global history of mobility, a larger framework within which to locate our local discussions, and to sum up a series of points. First of all, humans are mobile. Our norm is to be mobile. It's built into us. It's built into the way we eat, the way we stand, the way we move, to our sociality. It develops things that some of our near relatives have, but much, much further than any of them do. Humans are the only thing that moves as far as humans are fleas, and they move with us. Mobility over different ranges has been integral to a huge range of lifestyles. I said nothing about hunter-gatherers, but there are many different ways of being mobile. It's not a choice between moving and staying still. Just as there are many ways to be sedentary, there are many ways to be mobile. And maybe every society has points where there are options available, as well as people moving across that boundary. The history of mobility as a deviant activity is the history of cities and states. In other words, it's a history of the last 6,000 years. A world which tries either to force people to move Assyrians moving their people out, or which tries to make them stay where they are. So attempts to control and limit this human capacity are the concomitant of civilization as defined in terms of cities and states. And then what modern states have done with so much more energy. Finally, mass mobility today offers a way of mapping global inequalities and injustices. And so this isn't so visible when you look at a particular movement, when you look at a particular population moving from one place to another. But seen on a global scale, which I think is the appropriate way to see mobility, mobility is an index of the capacity of people to be free, and limits to mobility is an index of the capacity of states to stop them. Thanks for your attention.
Hi, everyone. I'm so delighted and honored to be here. We're going to stick with the sea here as well. I'm going to now draw some broad lines between ancient and modern mobility within the specific contexts of ancient Roman imperialism, modern Euro-Italian imperialism, and mobility in the ancient Mediterranean before and during Rome's rise into the region's dominant power. I aim to juxtapose and comment broadly, my emphasis on broadly here, on aspects of the mobility regimes of the modern Mediterranean and the ancient Mediterranean between the 6th and mid-1st centuries BCE. I'm interested in the concept of mare nostrum, or our sea, a Latin term for the peaceful and politically united Mediterranean of the Roman Empire, and how this concept links and doesn't link ancient and modern Mediterranean mobility regimes, imperialisms, ancient, modern, and enduring, and identities imposed, created, and claimed. Although I'm sharing a set of very loosely related thoughts, I hope nevertheless to create a space for discussing the echoic quality of imperial formations in this region, how they form, how they are represented. And I hope this can serve as one of many potential starting points for considering their relevance or lack thereof to the arid zones that are the subject of this conference, alongside, perhaps, Mediterranean hegemony in scholarship on ancient mobility. I'm happy for the opportunity to return to a subject I raised a few years ago in the Journal of Roman Studies. I argue that ancient historians must recognize that the Roman Mediterranean is replete with disconnectivities, so to speak, alongside and because of the connectivity that Peregrine Horton and Nicholas Purcell identified a quarter century ago in their revolutionizing volume, The Corrupting Sea, in which they described the exceptionally close coherence of microregions in the ancient Mediterranean, or I should say pre-modern Mediterranean. Celebration, as Danel Padilla Peralta has put it, of the region's connectivity takes the form of valuing, even valorizing, at least implicitly, the destructiveness of Roman imperialism. In JRS, I argued that we should consider the multitudinous and diverse disconnections that Roman imperialism produced. A particularly well-known example is Aemilius Paulus' settlement of Macedonia in 167 BCE, following the Third Macedonian War against Perseus, the son of Philip V of Macedon. The Roman author Livy reports, for instance, that the commander determined that the Macedonians would be free to follow their own laws, but that the kingdom would be divided into 4 parts and intermarriage would be prohibited across the populations therein. Other disconnections include the displacement of populations from their homelands through enslavement or other coerced mobilities, and the construction of the much celebrated Roman road, which could rewire traditional circuitries of passage and interaction to support new administrative priorities. We can locate the tendency to see, seek out, and celebrate Mediterranean connectivity and connectedness under the Roman Empire in a few places. One, obviously, is the cradle of colonialism, in which the disciplines of ancient Greek and Roman studies were nourished. They narrated a European past that legitimized a European present. So we'll forever be in the process of decolonizing these areas. But another and related factor is a pervasive and fundamentally pro-capitalist and imperialist approach that values increased and thus improved productivity, for example, in the territories that Rome conquered and exploited. Moreover, the personal experience of the Mediterranean among those in the discipline with citizenships that allow us to encounter the region as a zone of free, open, cosmopolitan, charming mobility, retreading the grand tour, but we assume with more liberal values, obscures these realities of Roman domination. We're privileged to experience this central region of the empire as the cosmopolitan wonder that the Greek writer Aelius Aristides breathlessly described in his Roman oration in the 2nd century CE. I should note here that I made these arguments a few years ago, so when it comes to the mobilities of Americans in particular, drastic change in the near term seems likely. The modern Mediterranean is the site of a complex international mobility regime and constellation of transnational mobility practices that European states have shaped in response to what historian Emmanuel Comte calls flows or pressures for flows of people with the prospect of lasting settlement across their borders. We can adjust this to include temporary settlement as well. Europe's migration regime today emerged slowly in the wake of the Second World War, impacted in part by differential labor needs across Western Europe and propelled in part too by strong German interest in Western cooperation and cohesion. I won't and can't, as a non-specialist, summarize the development of this regime over the 20th century. But I want to point out that policies of exclusion informed by imperial pasts and present have shaped Europe's current migration regime from early on. Let's take, for instance, the Treaty of Rome, signed on March 25th, 1957 by the 6, Belgium, France, West Germany, Italy, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. The treaty set up the European Economic Community and established a common market, making provisions for the free movement of persons by 1970. A major concern shaping the final treaty revolved around who exactly would enjoy this free movement. The question hinged on an imperial geography. Would the dozens of millions of people in Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Caribbean, that is, in the overseas possessions of Belgium, France, and the Netherlands, enjoy that movement? No. To dwell further on the subject of closure, I want to leap forward in time to the 21st century and consider Italy in particular for a moment. The migration regimes of the modern Mediterranean continue to articulate and reproduce imperial geographies. On October 18th, 2013, Italy launched a naval and air operation dubbed Mare Nostrum. The operation was launched following the shipwreck of 2 boats of refugees from several African countries earlier that month near the Italian island of Lampedusa. Over 600 human beings perished. As Sam Agbamu argues, with Operation Mare Nostrum, Italy claimed a sovereignty over the sea as well as the land on its opposite shore by invoking ancient Rome's Mare Nostrum, in an era in which the Mediterranean was politically united under the Roman Empire. This was only the latest iteration of such a practice in recent memory. Agbamu traces one invocation to fascist Italy, when Mussolini explicitly looked to Rome's legacy in order to, as Agbamu puts it, extend Italian control in its Libyan colonies of Tripolitania and Cyrenaica, reanimating Italy's control of the sea and the North African territories beyond. This recurrence exemplifies what Stephanie Home might call empire's Mobius strip. Imperial formations, she argues, at different times and in different places surface, submerge, entangle, disappear, resurface, and infinitely loop back on themselves like a Mobius strip. According to the International Organization for Migration, a UN-affiliated organization, Operation Mare Nostrum facilitated the safe arrival of some 150,000 migrants from Africa and the Middle East in Europe, where many subsequently pursued claims for asylum. Their safe arrival, which was widely criticized as incentivizing increased migration to Europe, and the operation's steep cost, which other EU countries refused to help defray, led to the demise of Operation Mare Nostrum, which officially concluded almost exactly 12 months after it began, although it did not fully cease operations until the end of 2014. Thereafter, as Martina Tazzioli argues, Italy insisted that the EU lead an operation in the frame of a burden-sharing logic. Operation Mare Nostrum, an Italian operation, was replaced by EU operations like Triton. These focused on policing, surveillance, and deterrence rather than rescue. Mare Nostrum gave way also to a 2-week operation called Mos Maiorum, a Latin phrase that translates to by the customs of the ancestors, which was similarly focused on policing, surveillance, and deterrence. As Agbamu points out, the operation's name suggested a shift to an earlier prior tradition or custom of keeping outsiders out and insiders in. These developments occurred amid a European practice of outsourcing policing to non-European states from around 2008. One example is a 2016 agreement between the European Council and Turkey, which sought to stop, quote unquote, irregular migration via Turkey to Europe. To return to Italy specifically, we could look to 2017's Italy-Libya deal. In exchange for money and technical support, the Libyan Coast Guard was tasked with keeping migrants from Italy, another case of empire's Mobius strip, wherein an imperial formation reemerges. The deal has been renewed several times. Agreements like these have forced migrants off of shorter, safer routes and subjected them to European-sponsored human rights abuses in other countries. Today, the central Mediterranean is the deadliest border in the world. Indeed, Italy's Operation Mos Maiorum asserted with its name a customary or traditional practice of exclusion that is perhaps more appropriate than those who named the operation may have realized. In that respect, the controls on modern Mediterranean mobility that I've just mentioned share some interesting and broad similarities with controls in the ancient Mediterranean prior to the creation of Rome's Mare Nostrum. Now, there's no official date for when the sea became the Sea of Rome's Mare Nostrum, of course, but many scholars often look to the comments of Polybius in the mid-2nd century BCE, a Greek statesman who wrote a history of Rome's conquest of the Mediterranean as he was witnessing it. He described the world of the Mediterranean thus: previously, the doings of the world had been, so to say, dispersed, as they were held together by no unity of initiative, results, or locality. But ever since this date, and he's referring to 167 BCE, history has been an organic whole, and the affairs of Italy and Libya have been interlinked with those of Greece and Asia, all leading up to one end. To Polybius's mind, Rome had made a whole out of fragments that were, he provocatively exaggerates, isolated from each other. Elsewhere, he claims that the Greeks had no knowledge of the Carthaginians prior to Rome's conquest. The achievement of this unity is among the reasons he asks, for who is so indifferent or indolent as not to wish to know by what means and under what system of polity the Romans in less than 53 years succeeded in subjecting nearly the whole inhabited world to their sole government, a thing unique in history? Or who again is there so passionately devoted to other spectacles or studies as to regard anything as a greater moment than the acquisition of this knowledge? As I tell the students in my Roman history survey, what are you doing with your life if you're not majoring in Roman history? Let's examine this interlinking between the late 6th and late 1st centuries BCE. So about 4 centuries before Polybius's birth, which was around 200, to about a century after his death, which was around 118.
Over this period, we see Rome involved in a series of pacts with other states that aimed at controlling the movements of select populations. These pacts were tools for asserting imperial power and creating new subjects and new imperial geographies. I'll begin with the treaties that preceded Rome's expansion beyond Italy at a time when Carthage dominated the Western Mediterranean. And as I sketch this out, I'll share some comments on claims making. Founded in the 8th century BCE in North Africa by travelers from the Levantine city-state of Tyre, by the 6th century BCE, Carthage was the dominant power of the Western Mediterranean. It was clearly the senior party when it first struck a treaty with Rome around 509, around when the Romans were founding their republic. The treaty regulates the movements of Romans and their allies in the Western Mediterranean. It dictates, for example, that the Romans and their allies are not to sail beyond the fair promontory, unless forced by storm or by enemies. It's forbidden to anyone to carry beyond it by force, to buy or carry away anything beyond what is required for the repair of his ship or for sacrifice, and he must depart within 5 days. The fair promontory, Polybius tells us, lies in front of Carthage to the north. It's been tentatively identified as today's Cap Bon, Tunisia, although there are other options. Does this mean that Roman and allied sailors were barred from Carthage itself? The treaty's restrictions on Roman movement suggest that the Carthaginians were accounting for the possibility that the growth of the new republic on the Tiber would precipitate new mobilities. By controlling that mobility, Carthage asserted a right of regulation. That assertion was also made with the somewhat freer movement of Carthaginians. The treaty does not put limitations on where the Carthaginians can go. In fact, although it restricts the nature of Carthaginian military activity in Latium, with the statement that if the Carthaginians should seize a Latin city, they will hand it over unharmed to the Romans, it implicitly sanctions passage to and within Italy and access even to Latium, where Rome was located. Did the Carthaginians really expect to engage in military activity in Latium? It's hard to say. But the treaty's provisions for Carthaginian presence in Italy forced the Romans, who desired recognition for their newborn republic and grain to feed it, to acknowledge Carthaginian dominance of the West. Migration regimes, to refer to Comte again, respond to flows or expected flows of people. So they require adjustment when circumstances change. These circumstances are apparent in the second treaty between Rome and Carthage, struck about a century and a half later in 348 BCE. Carthage remains the senior party, and this second treaty states that the Romans will not sail under arms, trade, or found a city on the further side of the fair promontory, Mastia and Tarsion, adding to the fair promontory 2 cities that may have been located on Iberia's Mediterranean coast, to which the hand of Carthage now stretched. However, Rome's sphere of control seemed to be expanding too. At the time of this treaty, Rome was warring with the Latin cities and the Samnites. Very trace evidence also suggests that Rome had sought around this time to establish settlements of some kind on Sardinia and Libya. This may be why the Second Treaty explicitly bars Roman sailors and their allies from those areas, 2 places absent from the First Treaty and which, in the interval, had become subject to Carthaginian influence. In the case of Sardinia. As Virgil's Aeneas would later exemplify, sailors, whether they were merchants or refugees of war, could be crypto-colonists. The rest is well-known history. In 264, Rome, Carthage, and the Sicilian city-state of Syracuse collided in a dispute about the Sicilian city-state of Messana. The ensuing First Punic War concluded in 241 with Rome's victory and the collapse of Carthaginian dominance in the West. The Treaty of Lutatius, struck by Rome and Carthage at the conclusion of this war, says nothing explicitly about where Romans and their allies can or cannot go or be present. We can assume that the possibilities had grown exponentially. The treaty is, however, pretty loud about Carthage. The Carthaginians are to evacuate the whole of Sicily, that is, Western Sicily, over which Carthage had maintained a wobbly influence. A subsequent addendum to the treaty stipulated that all islands lying between Sicily and Italy, presumably the Lipari Islands, should be evacuated too. Not long afterwards, Rome seized Corsica and Sardinia. We can compare and contrast these examples with treaties that Rome struck with states in the Eastern Mediterranean during its wars in that region to see a feature missing from the treaties with Carthage, the outsourcing, as it were, of mobility controls to other states in a manner that, in piecemeal fashion, contributed to the slow process of establishing the Mediterranean that would become the Mare Nostrum of Rome. For example, a treaty struck in 154 BCE between Rome and the city of Methymna on the Greek island of Lesbos states, "The people of Rome shall not grant passage officially or maliciously through their own land or through land under Roman control to public or private enemies of the people of Methymna." In 105, Rome and the Greek island city-state of Astypalaia struck a treaty that reads, "The people of the Astypalians shall not grant passage to the enemies and opponents of the people of the Romans through their own land and the land that the people of the Astypalians control. The people of the Romans shall not grant passage to the enemies and opponents of the people of the Astypalians." And in 25, Rome and the Greek island city-state of Mytilene on Lesbos too renewed an earlier pact with the treaty that, among other regulations, states, "The people of Mytilene shall not officially permit enemies of the Roman people to pass through their territory." These treaties sought to constrain and protect the movements of populations, in part by outsourcing these practices to other states. In the treaty with Methymna, Rome promises to bar the movement of Methymna's enemies in Italy and territories under its control. But Astypalaia and Mytilene make a similar promise in their treaties to prevent the passage of any who might pose a risk to Rome. These treaties are intentionally vague about the identities of these enemies in order to accommodate future shifts in regional geopolitics. They also prevented locals from joining mercenary armies and thus suddenly becoming Rome's enemies. Theoretically, tens of thousands accessed a safety of movement that they may not have possessed previously in the violent anarchy of the ancient Mediterranean world and the 2nd century BCE in particular. Furthermore, the treaties defined, for the purposes of claims to control and who had it, what it means to be Roman, according to where you can go. The allies of Rome are made into a special order of Roman subjects because they receive the same rights of passage as Romans. And here are the states in question from north to south: Methymna, Mytilene, and Astypalaia. In that vein, we should consider alongside these bilateral treaties the so-called Lex de Provinciis Praetoriis, the law of the Praetorian provinces of about 100 BCE, which addressed Mediterranean piracy among other concerns. The relevant section demands that the citizens of Rome and the allies of the Latin name, likewise those of the people who are friends of the Roman people, may sail in safety and access their rights. Rome's early treaties with Carthage are a world away. Rome could declare that Romans and their allies had the right of movement and safety wherever they wished to go. 30 years later, in 70 BCE, Cicero exaggerated this perception to assert that even in places as remote as India, the importance and value of Roman citizenship was recognized. Theoretically, the Roman citizen was untouchable, empowered to move beyond Rome with the safety and access to rights that he could expect, also theoretically, at home. These treaties created a new and mobile subject, rendering temporarily non-Roman allies as their equals. Of course, the flip side needs consideration. Notionally, these treaties stripped tens of thousands of individuals of their ability to move through territories to which they previously had access, a series of disconnections, if you will. Through these treaties, Rome simultaneously lay claim to the Mediterranean while abjuring sole responsibility for producing the outcome of that claim. The utility of these treaties lay in their burden-sharing logic, to quote Tazioli regarding modern Italy's closure of Operation Mare Nostrum. Like other pre-modern empires, Rome did not and could not invest in personnel to comprehensively police land or sea. These treaties put the responsibility of enforcement on local communities of the Eastern Mediterranean. Yet, what I'm describing is as hypothetical as Carthage's claim to possible military action in Italy. How on earth would enforcement have occurred without technologies to verify identities, track people across vast maritime or terrestrial distances? Perhaps for Rome, as for Carthage, that was not the point. Perhaps what mattered, what brought Roman power into being, was to claim the right to dictate who could go or who could not go and where. Thank you.
Thank you both for these wonderful presentations. They have been incredibly diverse, and they will contrast fabulously, I think, with a lot of the conversations and discussions that are going to come up tomorrow. So what you've done is really broadened this idea of mobility beyond our little archaeological focus, and I think that is wonderful, and it underlines the importance of mobility for all of us today, however we want to come to this topic. So thank you. We have maybe 15 minutes for questions. I'm not sure. Do we have a roving microphone? Yes, we have microphones. So the floor is open. Please wait for someone to come to you with the microphone so we can all hear the questions.
I have a question. Well, actually, it's first of all, thank you very much. It's a good idea. Sorry. Better now. Thank you. So, as I was listening to both your lectures, I was first of all I was thinking about the idea of Mare Nostrum. All these, imperial terms of Pax Romana and Mare Nostrum and Pax Syriaca, and that archaeologists and historians are very often using. There are several studies that talk about the image of the Mediterranean and the image of the hegemonic image that imperial conveyed, and things that they wanted the ancients to believe, and things that they wanted, things that modern scholars actually adopted as they are, and that they became so, used by us so often. But in fact, we know, and as you suggested, that the sea was never pacified. There were rebellions. It was a bricolage of all kinds of ethnicities and ethnic groups and so on. And in fact, while imperial ideology conveyed a very strong message about the periphery and who inhabit the periphery and what kind of people live in what Mario Liverani called the disposable periphery, we know that empires, starting from the Assyrians, going to the Romans, Byzantines, and ending with the Ottomans, they all actually exerted very flexible strategies upon both the sea and the desert. And we are dealing with arid zones, and I think that you wrote a little bit about the arid zone as well, but I think that it's going very well to the sea. So I wonder if you can elaborate on the thing that you talked about, treaties with local populations as serving imperial interests. And I am especially interested in the agency of these locals, especially elites, the role of elite members in society in serving imperial interests, and empires as movers and shakers of the ancient world.
Yeah, well, I mean, in the case of these treaties, I think this question of agency is kind of an important one, because the language of the treaties presents the parties of the treaties as equal with the states in the Eastern Mediterranean. I think that's less the case in those two treaties with Carthage. And yet we know, and those involved in the creation of these treaties must have known, that the parties were not equal. And so, I mean, I actually don't know very much about how these treaties, like the process by which these treaties emerged, and I'm not sure that information is easily accessible. But I mean, my guess is that, states to some degree actually did understand and internalize the value of participating in these treaties, in part because of the zones of safe passage, quote unquote safe passage, that they produced. again, the question of enforcement is a kind of intriguing one, because there are no, to my knowledge, kind of maritime police, on the borders of these kind of island, populations that are involved in these particular treaties. But the possibility of zones of safe movement, I think, must have been internalized as something valuable, particularly given the dates of some of these treaties, because they are struck right in the middle of kind of intense, wars of conquest involving multiple states, and kind of in complex and shifting alliances, involving or not involving Rome. In terms of elites, only the elites could have been involved, I think, in the striking of these treaties. And so, again, it's a little bit like, category A, category B, that there is some, interest in the production of these zones of safe passage, but also very little choice when it came to, I think, particularly close to the end of the first, at the end of the 2nd century BCE, when, the tide had shifted, so to speak, in such a kind of significant way that, Rome had not conquered the Mediterranean, although we sometimes speak as if it had by that time, but was certainly in control or enjoyed strong influence over much of it. I don't know if you have thoughts, Greg.
First, thank you both for these excellent presentations. And I think this is probably a question for both of you. So I have the impression that if we were to sort of open up some history survey that was less sophisticated than we might want to be, we would find that up until the Hellenistic era, most of the action we would be reading about would be land-based, centered in the Near East, with Egypt and on one side, so to speak, some Nubia, etc., and another side, which would be Syria, Iraq, and running into what is today Iran. And we would be talking about population movements there. Then we begin to hit the Greco-Roman period, if I can use that generality, and the sea suddenly becomes the central action. What I sort of want to know is that a mistake of historiography that's acting that way? Or does that reflect a shift between a kind of land-based mobility to a sea-based mobility? And that would really fit the long-term view of Greg, if it's true, because, of course, eventually people cross the ocean to the New World, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Or, is that a correct impression? Or were land and sea always happening at once?
I think Paul Kosman might disagree in his recent book, The Ancient Shore. I think he talks about the kind of the vital role of the shore in kind of interactions among different populations. Among other things, the book is about a lot of things. So, this is a very short answer, and I think you should respond instead. But people are still moving around in these other places. So I don't know that there's a shift in the locus as opposed, in terms of where mobility is happening, as opposed to a shift in attention. In terms of where we are paying attention to it.
I wonder if that narrative that you accurately describe is the story of the mobile seen by the sedentary, and that we're tracking views outwards, which, from the first societies that are writing and recording. And, we think about our first epic poem, Gilgamesh. And central to that is the tension between the city builder in Uruk and then the man who runs around with the wild beasts. And so I do think that this membrane, if you like, between the mobile and the settled, which is both one of mutual strangeness, hostility, but also necessary interdependence. And I think that crops up again and again. And so I think that's the way I would imagine that narrative expanding. More people write, more people are settled, and the more they write, the more they're settled, the more they realise there are a lot of people who aren't like them around them.
So, hello everyone. Amazing lectures. Really enjoyed them. I'm actually going to expand on this concept. One of the things that I started thinking about when discussing this idea of control of the Mediterranean going back into and looking at earlier records of historical perspectives on mental landscapes. When one looks at Assyrian chronicles, the limits of the ordered world is actually defined both in terms of exactly this relationship, which is very intrinsic to Mesopotamia, of the city-state and the chaotic steppe. But when one looks at the Assyrian chronicles, which start expanding, the other great border of chaos is the Great Sea, is the Mediterranean. And there's kind of, it made me think that there's this kind of interesting tension in which you start exerting both control over the desert and control over the sea with technological advancements, caravans, shipbuilding techniques, and all of this that really expand both of these uncontrollable zones. And then moving into the question aspect, yes, you move into a perspective in which you have technology, you start traveling more, these places become more accessible in many ways. And the rhetoric changes. And you've very clearly shown that the rhetoric changes. In practice, however, and this is a question for everyone on the panel, in practice, however, the rhetoric changes. Does control itself of these zones change? How much does the state, the empire, how much is it able to penetrate both the arid and the wet, chaotic zones?
I can take it, if that's okay. So it's a very good question, actually, and I think that I think that the Mediterranean and the arid zones they can equally use to demonstrate imperial policies of control, because there is one thing, the imperial ideology, where if you read the Assyrians, for example, sources, they describe the desert as the place of the lions and the place of the beasts and the wild beasts, and terrible things happen there. And when they want to curse Asarchadon in his treatise, for example, when he wants to curse one of his allies, he sends him to the desert. He tells him, if you are going to break this alliance, you will be sent to the desert like a beast. So there is the image of the desert, and there is the reality. And in reality, the Assyrians didn't know the desert, neither do they know how to swim. And yes, and this is also true for the Romans, I think, because we have several examples of ships that drown, and we have all kinds of, so these empires that were landlocked empires, they needed the local people to negotiate those ecologies for them. And they actually used, especially local elites, that's why I asked Sailakshmi this question. I think that local elites were the channels through which empires used agents in order to negotiate those places, the sea and the desert, for them. And in fact, the secret of the Assyrians, as well as the Romans and the Ottomans, their long-lasting empires, was based upon being able to exert flexible control strategies over different ecological zones. So they realized that the same policy that they exerted, for example, in Syria, doesn't hold for Phoenicia or for the desert. And they knew how to deal with each group in its own territory. They were flexible, and this is, I think, the secret of control strategy, imperial control strategy. And Becoming Roman, your book, actually.
A long time ago.
Yeah, it's a very good one.
In a world of high-tech documents that say we're citizens of such and such a place and we can get admitted here or there, I'm familiar with the Roman diplomas for military service, but what other cultural artifacts did they use to demonstrate that they fit the rules for Romans to trade or whatever?
I'm not aware of a massive documentation of that kind. I mean, I think that there are quite a lot of communities that are places where people customarily meet. And some of these are literal ports, and some of them are what Balani would have called ports of trade. Tacitus talks about one city, which was the only one into which Germans were allowed to come to trade inside the empire. Probably wrong, but the notion that you might have a sort of a series of safe harbours, I think that recurs a bit. But I can't think of bills of passage or anything like that, or passports really.
There is like a kind of administrative maybe this is a strong word, but infrastructure for records that would indicate citizenship status that becomes kind of more systematic and complex from Augustus onwards. But nothing that people are really carrying around themselves. And I think, witness testimony and kind of personal relationships in which individuals account for the citizenship status of other individuals seems to form the basis of what we would instead now kind of think like we would require papers for that, and even in kind of recent scholarship that has emphasized the importance and sort of complexity and significance of this infrastructure of paperwork, basically. It's interesting that witness testimony in those kinds of documents about witnessing the birth of somebody, or I know that this person emancipated that person. That witness testimony is really central even in documents. So it's not as if the document simply says this person is a Roman citizen, but rather like that person said that person was emancipated and therefore a Roman citizen, that kind of thing. In Cicero's Verines, which were composed in 70 BCE, I mean, he has many, he describes Roman citizens saying, I'm a Roman citizen, as if this is supposed to be sufficient proof for immunity from abuse by the provincial governor of Sicily. And what's interesting about these assertions of Roman citizenship, which are very much like Paul's later assertion, I'm a Roman citizen, is that Cicero's problem is that not only does Verres this governor ignore the claim, I'm a Roman citizen, but ignores the fact that multiple individuals in these Sicilian cities who were themselves Roman citizens said, yes, that guy is actually a Roman citizen. So if the guy's own statement wasn't enough, which it should have been, then, the claims of these other people should have sufficed.
I think we have time for just one more question. Really? 7 o'clock? Oh. Yeah.
Amazing.
Thank you all so much. This was really, really great. So I just wanted to quickly return back to the notion of policing as well as those things that are on the margins. And so specifically, I'm thinking of like what falls in between the cracks. And so once all of this is being policed, especially objects and goods that are allowed to still move between the cracks, and really thinking about like the agency of objects and kind of conspicuous consumption of objects potentially being able to move more freely than certain peoples, but also the peoples that move those objects, are they administratively allowed to subvert the system, or are they taking it upon themselves to subvert the system potentially illicitly or in whatever capacity? And so just in that general sphere, I'm just curious of your thoughts on objects, of goods, of whether luxury or otherwise, of how these are seen or would be received in new spaces, in addition to how people may not be able to move and do the same thing that those objects could do.
I could have a go. There are clearly some things move enormous distances, spices, metals, salt. And this is before the period in which Lakshmi and I specialised as well. There's John might know this, there's a sceptre in the Etruscan Museum in Florence, which includes in it material made from ivory and amber. And so this attests in this sort of classical period to routes that stretch to the Baltic and at least to North Africa and maybe elsewhere. So certain objects move huge distances. And I think Colin Renfrew was right when he said in most of human history, prehistory, things move further than the information that accompanies them. So things will go to the point where as they pass from hand to hand down the line, eventually they are simply exotic. And some of their affordances are very obvious. You know what to do with spice. But some of them are not so obvious. And so, yeah, there is this huge... And, I mean, since we're talking about people of the tent and so on, the Eurasian corridor is one which connects stuff. So what Romans literally knew about China or China about Rome is minute. I mean, it's been looked very, very hard for, and they were spectacularly ignorant of each other. And yet goods move hand to hand, up and down and through the Indian Ocean areas as well. So yeah, objects do move huge distances. Is that an answer to the question?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to stick to time. If we want to stick to time, yes. So I would like to thank you both again for a fabulous opening for the conference. Thank you so much. And I would like to invite us all over to Hate's Lounge across the way. Yes, thank you very much. Thanks.
Mass mobility.
Huh?
Mass mobility.
Yeah.